Hi, everyone. Welcome to Act Now. I'm Julianna Forlano. We have such a great show for you today. I can't even believe it. Laura Packard is joining us to talk about the ACA deadline, which happens to be Saturday, and the new surprise medical bill rules that took effect January 1, which try to help people not be so shocked when they get a giant bill from their doctor that they didn't expect. So good news on that front. We're also going to be speaking with Laura about the Supreme Court's the vaccine mandate thing that the Supreme Court is looking at. There's a lot to talk about. We're not really going to talk about Build Back Better with her since it's on ice for January, as am I, since I'm in the Northeast. Brr, we've got Arctic temperatures over here, and the Arctic has Florida temperatures over there. Down is up and up is down. But first, we are turning to censorship, press freedom, and the state of the free press here in the United States. Andy Lee Roth, editor of Project Censored's State of the Free Press 2022, is joining me to discuss the most censored stories of 2021 and give us a look at the other issues that were at play last year, leading to, let's say, a less enlightened populace. That's coming up first in our new media breakdown segment that if you're a longtime Act TV or Julianna Forlano follower, you may recognize. This segment is called The Correction, and it's back. Since 1976's Project Censored has been at the forefront in the fight against censorship and the campaign for greater media literacy. Every year, they publish their State of the Free Press, which looks back on the challenges and the victories of last year, and it compiles a list of the top 20 censored stories. Joining us now to discuss these stories and the general state of the free press, Andy Lee Roth, Associate Director of Project Censored. He has edited 11 previous editions of Project Censored's yearbook, in addition to contributing chapters on Iceland and the Commons, the Military Commissions Act, and news photographs depicting the human cost of war, something I talk about on this show all the time. We have to depict the human cost of war instead of whitewashing, instead of cleaning it up. Andy Lee Roth is joining me here today. Andy, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much, Juliana. It's a pleasure to be on the show with you.
Well, let's just dive right in. First, before we get to the stories, the top 25 stories that were censored last year, how does Project Censored identify and evaluate independent news stories? How do you pick the ones that have been censored the most?
It's a year-long process that involves at least 5 formal stages of vetting and reviewing. So this year's book is out now, and we're already reviewing stories for the next year book. That process culminates, it begins, I should say, with students and faculty members at college and university campuses across North America identifying stories that are important news stories that appear to have been neglected or treated in a distorted way by the corporate news media. Those stories are reviewed for the quality of the reporting, the reliability of the sources, the transparency of the facts, as well as any competing corporate news coverage.
Why is it so important to look specifically at the corporate media news coverage and distortions when the internet is replete with, say, hosts like Joe Rogan or some of these others who spread misinformation but have bigger audiences than CNN?
Well, the corporate news media continue, especially the print news media, the papers like the Washington Post and the New York Times continue to drive the news agenda, even in a digital internet age. Most of the stories that circulate and recirculate on social media platforms and others ultimately originate with those big establishment print news outlets. There are some there are some qualifications to that claim, but that's essentially still true. Most Americans, the news that most Americans receive, just like most of the media that Americans receive, are produced by a handful of 5 or 6 large corporations. And so if we don't understand what those corporations, who and what those corporations are treating as newsworthy, and how they're framing the events of the day as news, we don't have a very good handle on our society, our politics, and indeed, in many cases, our own, home communities.
That's interesting. They're setting the agenda for sure, even for the talkers on the internet, which sometimes, spread disinformation, and sometimes they're right on the money. It's really hard to know what's going on these days because the outlets are difficult to trust, be they online or corporate, and people are just stopping trusting the news. The corporate media for sure has taken a big hit. Who is still watching these things?
Well, a lot of people. It's still very profitable. But as Project Censored's founder, Carl Jensen, said years ago now, he coined the term news inflation. And it was the idea that we have more and more of it, but it seems to be worth less and less. And so you could think of what the project is doing, validating these independent news stories that we compile into a list of our top 25 stories every year, as an effort to counter the forces of news inflation. To say, amidst all the flurry of 24/7 news, pundits' hot takes, et cetera, here are some stories that you probably didn't hear about that you ought to know more about, because they go to the very core of who we are as a nation and where we're headed.
So let's talk about the specific stories that you have in the top 25. I guess, as I was looking through these, I was very excited because we actually covered a whole bunch of these stories. I'm like, we did that. We covered it. We covered the essential workers demanding protection amid the pandemic and the strikes that erupted around that. We covered the cancer-causing PFAS in the Arctic. We covered a whole bunch of things. Are there areas that like the environment or healthcare or workers' rights that show up more than others in the top 25?
Yeah, there definitely are story themes. There are recurrent story themes tracing all the way back to the project's earliest story lists in the late 1970s and continuing up to the present. So, I think you can think about this as sort of analytically in terms of stories that involve systemic social problems are often not well covered by the corporate news media. Corporate news is often about what went wrong today, as opposed to what goes wrong every day. And so there are, in effect, blank areas, blinders on a lot of corporate journalism in terms of systemic social problems that have everyday impacts, but don't crystallize in a single dramatic news event on any given day.
That's interesting because last year, or was it the year before? Yeah, the year before, the Rachel Maddow program focused almost exclusively on Russiagate, and that did not really have any daily effect on people's lives, even though what could be considered the breaking news of this document, the breaking news of who he said on Twitter, etc., were happening all the time. So it seems like they're able to pick those stories they follow long term as are ones that don't actually affect people, like the fact that PFAS are forever chemicals are being found in the Arctic, which is a real problem.
I think you could explain that in terms of some things we do know about corporate media. That line, the Russiagate line of coverage as an ongoing story, was, I think, very lucrative for MSNBC and Rachel Maddow. Right, it drew ratings, And the corporate news game is about ratings, which lead to advertisers. And even in this age of kind of economic crisis for journalism as a profession, that was still a very expeditious topic for them to pursue. The other element to, I think, the Russiagate story that led to it having legs, right, to it being something that Maddow could cover night after night, and people were still interested in it, was it was a kind of a wonderful gestalt figure in terms of partisan interests, right? And so it served, it was almost magnetic in terms of there was something to glom onto for people who perceived themselves as coming at it from a liberal perspective or from a conservative perspective. And again, eyes on the screen is the name of the game for corporate outlets. So I think that story would qualify basically, that story as Maddow and MSNBC covered it. We've actually written a fair amount about that in previous censored yearbooks. Would be a great example of what Project Censored analyzes as news abuse, an important story that has been so spun that the significance of it is probably lost on most of the audience, and that spin in this case, I think, originates, to be critical for a moment, with probably how Maddow's show handled it and how MSNBC presented it. So I think there was probably, well, people who follow independent news would know that there was a much greater diversity of perspectives than was being aired on Maddow's show about Russiagate and what we ought to have been concerned about during that time period.
And that's where those people like, the left commentators, even the far left commentators on the internet, or those commentators who don't fit into one specific political ideology, I think they really had an effect, because they really took this Russiagate scandal to task for my MSNBC specifically edging out other stories like the ones that you have in the list here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Russiagate, I mean, I think also Russiagate, it was like in that sense, a fantastic story, because the enemy is external, rather than having to look self-critically at our own institutions and their vulnerabilities. The Russiagate story, as it was fanned and extended, allowed us to focus on an external enemy or threat.
Well, certainly the story you have here that was one of the top 25 is the high drug prices could result in premature deaths of more than 1.1 million seniors in the next decade. Talk about that story and how it got to be on the top 25.
Yeah. So that story is our number one story this year. It was reported by Kenny Stansel for the independent news outlet Common Dreams, based on a study by the West Health Policy Center, which projected out that by the year 2030, more than 1.1 million seniors in the federal government's Medicare program would be likely to die prematurely because they would be unable to afford the high prices of the prescription medications that they were on. So basically, the West Health study projected out approximately 112,000 preventable deaths per year. These are due to, which would put what they call cost-related non-adherence ahead of common causes of death in the U.S., like diabetes, influenza, pneumonia, and kidney disease.
Interesting. That's fascinating. I mean, that gets us into the conversation that I'm about to have with our next guest about how the mainstream media is almost, I mean, all of the commercials on these channels are big pharma commercials. So, yeah. I mean, is there evidence or is it just suggestive that because they get so much money from these pharmaceutical companies that they shun coverage of these kinds of stories?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the corporate media covering corporate interests. So we don't, at Project Censored, we stopped using the term mainstream media to describe corporate media some time ago, because as the former director of the project, Peter Phillips, argued, the corporate media no longer represent They no longer report on behalf of the interests of the American mainstream, however that might be defined. They report on and reflect the interests of corporate outlets. I think the interesting thing about this study, in terms of two more things I would add about this number one story about prescription drug costs potentially becoming a leading cause of death. One is, of course, rising drug costs have been very much in the news. They were very much part of the 2020 presidential electoral campaign, both in the primaries and later on. But what we haven't seen, what Project Censored found absolutely no coverage of during our vetting process, was any reference in the corporate news media to this West Health Policy Center study. It was completely omitted. The other thing is the study not only identified problems, it also identified solutions. And some of those solutions have been on the political table to some extent. For instance, empowering Medicare to negotiate directly with drug companies on behalf of patients for prices, which is something that Bernie Sanders has been advocating for some time, would, according to the West Health study, prevent as many as 93,000 deaths a year and save some $475 billion by 2030. So I think the lack of coverage is very much reflects the idea that corporate news provides us with a narrow definition of who and what count as newsworthy.
Did this story go ahead.
And in this case, it results in people not knowing about policy solutions that could readily address the concerns raised.
Did this story get a lot of coverage? You mentioned it was in Common Dreams. Did it get a lot of coverage in the independent posts?
Other independent news outlets picked this up, but again, not as much as you might expect for the scope of the problem, right? Which is an important thing to add. Like, the stories that are listed on our top 25 story list, it doesn't mean they've received no coverage at all or no corporate news coverage whatsoever. When we talk about them as top 25 censored stories, what we mean is that they have not received coverage proportional to the magnitude of the issues at stake. And therefore, it's likely that most Americans will not have heard about these stories, allowing for exceptions like people who follow your show are in the know on some of these stories because your definition of who and what counts as newsworthy on Act Now is broader than the corporate news media's definition of that.
It sure is. And thank you for saying that out loud. We try for sure. The next story, which I think was listed on the top 25, was threats, violence, trolling, and frivolous lawsuits used to silence journalists who are investigating financial crimes. This is a survey, and the story was by Spencer Woodman. Talk about how I'm shocked that wasn't covered by outlets who are beholden to corporate interests.
This is one of our stories where, as I mentioned, those 5 separate stages of review that ultimately go to a panel of 28 international judges who rank order the stories for us by voting on them. To the best ability of our research, we found no corporate news coverage of this study, which was originally produced by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, who found that basically global elites have been using a range of tactics, everything from trolling on social media and verbal harassment to defamation lawsuits and physical violence, to persuade journalists conducting financial misconduct to attempt to persuade those journalists not to pursue those stories. Right. And as Susan Cocktree, who's the director of the Foreign Policy Center, told Spencer Woodman for this story, the study gave explosive insights into how political and business elites, as well as organized crime groups all over the world, are getting away with financial crime and corruption. So this is one of those stories where, every year at Project Censored, we get some stories where we just look at each other and go, how could this not have been covered?
The Pandora Papers came out this year. It seemed like
Mhm.
a breakthrough in journalism around financial crimes and financial malfeasance. Your thoughts about how that plays into this?
Well, I think these are all kind of, I mean, I think that's further corroboration, right? And before that, we had the Panama Papers offered vivid insights. I would say a couple things about those stories generally. Um, One is they reveal how, right, those stories were mostly the result of what will get referred to sometimes as leaks, right? And they didn't come through, by and large, they didn't start coming through kind of so-called mainstream corporate news outlets. So that's an important observation. I think the other thing is that they show that those stories were not kind of suppressed for as long as they were because there was prior restraint on them.
Mm.
What we're talking about here are kind of like the lack of public knowledge about those stories before they broke were really the result of kind of indirect forms of censorship, right? And this story about journalists investigating financial crimes being threatened by global elites is just a kind of epitomizes that, right? This is about the chilling effects that the harassment of journalists
It's really interesting. Like your
has on
list.
what we know about what we as the public know about these financial institutions and how they in effect do business, either legitimately or otherwise.
Your list, by the way, has given me a list of guests to call and have on the program. So I do appreciate that aspect of it. And I just getting back to something that you said when we were covering the first story, a propaganda system is even more detrimental to its populace when it gives you a little bit of coverage, or it gives you a little bit. So there's, plausible deniability. Well, we did cover that a tiny bit, but
Mhm.
I really wanted to underscore the point that you made, which is they're not covered in, in relation to in ratio to the amount of effect they have on the American public or the public at large.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, that it's it's not that there should be only stories about financial crime in the news, but that news that excludes the kind of perspective provided by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in this story, where they surveyed journalists and they found that 71% of the journalists they talked to have been subject to some form of harassment in the course of investigating financial crimes, then a serious piece of our understanding of the world is missing, right?
Fascinating. Another one of the stories that was on the top 25, the strikes erupt as U.S. essential workers demand protection amid the pandemic. The story by Michael Cianato. Did I say that right?
Donato at the Guardian, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that story did kind of make a breakthrough, though, at some point.
Yes, yes. I mean, so the story of the historic wave of wildcat strikes for workers' rights goes back to the earliest days of the pandemic, March 2020. And I would give a shout out to Michael Sonato at the Guardian, but also a huge shout out to Mike Elk at the Payday Report, who since the beginning of the pandemic, the Payday Report, which is this very small independent news organization out of the Midwest, focused on labor issues. They've been tracking every single wildcat strike that's taken place, every single kind of worker disruption. They've tracked and documented 1,750 of these since March of 2020. So there has been corporate news coverage of worker disruptions in response to the dangers posed by the pandemic and the kinds of pressures put on so-called frontline workers, essential workers, to continue to work despite the dangers that the pandemic poses for them. What the corporate news media have not done is connect the dots on this story. That's exactly what Mike Elk at the Payday Report, with his Strike Wave interactive map, the COVID 2019 Strike Wave interactive map, documents these and connects the dots and shows us that basically what's going on in the United States right now over the last 18 to 24 months has been the largest spate of wildcat strikes in the United States since the late 1960s, early 1970s. That's a huge news story that has been completely missed. This goes back to the point you were making a moment ago, Juliana, completely missed because the corporate news media have covered this story as a matter of as episodic work stoppages. Here, there, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. The only exception to this, there have been two exceptions to this, and it is changing now. One is in the summer of 2020, suddenly the New York Times, the Post, CNN, and others were very interested in wildcat strikes when it was Major League Baseball players and National Basketball Association players going out on strike to protest the police killing of Jacob Blake. Suddenly, worker strikes, walkouts and disruptions were interesting, but that was because they were Major League Baseball players and NBA stars doing the striking, and that was a short-lived strike in both those sports. More recently, though, of course, we have gotten coverage of worker unrest and worker organization, all in the frame of the corporate media of Striketober, and then more awkwardly Strikevember. And I don't know if we're in Strike January now or whatever the portmanteau is. But basically the point would be it took the corporate news media a year and a half to catch up to what Mike Elk and the Payday Report have been tracking since the beginning of the pandemic, which is that there's an unprecedented level of worker organization, oftentimes outside of official union avenues, although we're seeing some very interesting developments now in terms of worker efforts to unionize at places like Amazon and Starbucks, and those are stories worth tracking. Not only for
we're tracking them here, you can keep following us.
Not only for whether the corporate news media are covering them, but, and this is a key point, how they're covering them. Who are they talking to, right?
Yeah, well, that's what I noticed is a lot of the coverage. The Financial Times is covering some of these things. There is actually quite a bit of coverage, but always through the frame of, these organizers are corrupt. These workers are just immigrants who want more of your money. It'll never work. All of that stuff. I did notice an uptick in coverage, but it was just minimizing what was going on.
Mm-hmm. I just saw a great political cartoon. The cartoon is framed as you're in the office of the big corporate bosses. They're looking out their window at the striking workers down below who are saying, like, fair wages now, we need protection, blah, blah, blah. And the one corporate boss is saying to the other, all they ever do is think about money.
Yes. Then in the interest of time, I'm going to have to squeeze the next two stories into one, which is going to be terrible. But if you're watching, you can go to Project Censored on the internet and you can look into the stories, look at the report, the state of the free press, and you can get more information on that there. But two more of the stories are Colonizing the Atmosphere, How Rich Western Nations Drive the Climate Crisis by Sarah Lazar. And the other one we mentioned earlier were More Traces of Cancer Causing PFAS in the Arctic, Raise Alarm Over Global Spread by Daniel Ross. These two are both about basically the environment, whether it's the climate crisis or the actual environmental degradation that goes on that's not the climate crisis, which I feel gets zero coverage ever. Your thoughts about, the climate and or environmental crisis in general, and how many stories, are missed and mischaracterized and not covered as much as they need to be.
Yeah, let me begin by saying anyone interested in these or other stories can go to projectcensored.org and find the entire list of this year's top 25, plus all the top 25 story lists going back to the first year of the project in 1976. They're all online at our website. The environment, and especially the climate crisis, is entirely underreported. And when it is reported, it's often reported in biased ways that reflect again, corporate interests. One of the great examples I think of is how, it was basically, PR people working for big oil companies who introduced the idea of the carbon footprint, right? Which we all now talk about, our carbon footprints. And that was a campaign designed to individualize the response to the climate crisis and to let the real purveyors of the climate crisis off the hook. The story that Sarah Lazare reports for In These Times about climate debtor nations having colonized the atmosphere is based on research by Jason Hickel, who's an economic anthropologist who basically looked at global populations of all the world's nations and looked at carbon emissions and calculated a kind of a fair amount of emissions per person in the country. And then he calculated which countries are overshooting their fair share of the environment and which are undershooting. And lo and behold, guess what he finds? Western nations, the so-called Northern Hemisphere, is taking far more than their fair share in a way that, as Sarah Lazare reports, represents a kind of a long-term pattern we know about colonization, the extraction of resources by the Northern Hemisphere Western countries at the expense of the Southern Hemisphere and so-called developing countries. There's much more detail to this than I can convey now, but I think what's important about this story is it provides a fact-based, evidence-based assessment of something that many of us may perhaps believe as a political stance. And second, that when this report came out, it was basically buried. There was, again, Project Censored's research, this extensive year-long process, we found no corporate coverage of Hinkle's report in any of the major news outlets that we track.
Well, I'm sorry that we're out of time because I would like to go over one by one each of the 25 stories. But again, projectcensored.org is where you can look further into these stories. Andy, we talked briefly about the other sort of major issues that we've seen that are threatening the free press. We talked about news abuse. You also mentioned censorship by proxy by the tech industry and humilitainment. Can you talk a little bit about those other sort of overarching issues that you've seen over the past year?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've mentioned some the pandemic, and I would point anyone, journalism has been hit hard by the pandemic, just like every other segment of the economy. I would point people to the Poynter Institute, which keeps track of newsroom closures and layoffs as a result of the pandemic. And it was last month that they released that more than 100 local news stations have been closed due to the pandemic. So local news, which we already talk about how there are in effect local news deserts, places where there is no coverage of local stories, that the desertification of local news has been increased by the pandemic. I'm also very interested in what we at Project Censored are talking about more and more as the new algorithmic gatekeeping. How so many of the stories that we know about because they've come to us through our social media feeds. And of course, these big social media platforms do not see themselves as engaged in journalism. They do not adhere to journalistic codes of ethics. They are not interested in anything except keeping your eyes on that screen and how that affects their bottom line. And so as algorithms more and more determine the kind of news stories that we see when we're on social media, they also shape the kinds of stories that are getting circulated. There are increasing questions and concerns about the transparency of news sourcing and really the public's access to high quality independent journalism.
Well, this is why, I have friends who've started, online talk channels on YouTube or this or that one. And they just kind of see where the algorithm goes. and then they just follow it, and they become very big overnight. Whereas we've had to sort of be word of mouth and reaching out to our audiences on our own to say, hey, listen, we're doing this story because we're going with the Act TV. We go outside to what's in the algorithm to set our own agenda, like by covering some of these stories that you mentioned here and some of the other ones as well. And we pay the price because we don't ride the algorithm, and we really pay the price. You have to know about Act TV in order to find the shows that are here. The algorithm isn't going to help you find us.
Yeah, and I think that's true of a lot of independent news reporting. And so one of the challenges and one of the aims of the project is to elevate the profile of those outlets so that more people know about them. And I think on the consumer side, one of the things we can do is don't rely on your social media platform to provide you news. Subscribe directly to the email listserv or link or RSS feed for that outlet. Find ways of getting that news directed to you without the social media intermediary, so that you're taking away some of the power, the influence of those algorithmic gatekeepers and the corporations that benefit from them.
God, our other guest is here and waiting, but I do have this final question that I'd really like to get your thoughts on, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to nutshell them for us, but Project Censored started in 1976. That's before the entrance of Fox News, at least on the major scene, right? They didn't break through as a major player until much later. And even in our conversation, we've been focused on some of the CNNs, the MSNBCs, because there's an expectation that if you're progressive, you should cover these progressive, I guess it shouldn't be progressive that we're poisoning the Arctic, but these progressive issues. What role does the sort of propaganda arm of the right and far right in the US play in how has it factored into Project Censored's work that there is basically a propaganda arm that goes beyond just corporate interest? Because MSNBC serves corporate interest in one way and Fox serves it in another way, as far as I can tell. What are your thoughts?
Right. I mean, that's kind of the silo stovepiping that has been very much kind of a topic of concern for people interested in news and public affairs issues lately. I mean, I think the thing is, if you trace the history of, my training is as a sociologist, and so my background in news is the history of journalism in the United States. And if you trace that history back, the earliest newspapers back in the days of the penny press, right, when you could buy a newspaper on the street corner, were all overtly partisan. And everyone knew that those papers represented a particular political interest, if not a party. And I think we've kind of come to that today, where no one listening to Fox News or MSNBC thinks they're getting anything other than a partisan take. All right. There may be different degrees of their acceptance that this is a partisan take, but I think that's in there, right? The challenge, I think, is whether we're talking about one or the other, those are enormous platforms that I often liken to like mega fast food restaurants, right? And what we're trying to do at the project is remind people that there's a farmer's market out there. There's a farmer's market out there with independent producers who, the food is organic and locally sourced, and you get to know the person who's produced it. And that's sort of my simple metaphor for why we need to pay attention to independent news outlets across the political spectrum, not necessarily exclusively progressive ones, independent news outlets that are going to go beyond the kind of fast food version of what news ought to look like, right? And what I would tell my students when we would talk about this in class would be, at first, everyone thinks like, oh, the farmer's market's going to cost more. It's not going to be as tasty. It's not convenient, right? But if you do it for a while, then you realize like, wow, this is delicious. And my bill hasn't gone up, right? There's independent news out there that's as good or better than anything on offer from the corporate media.
So true. Like
but
this
it's
show.
harder. It's a little harder to find. It takes more effort to find, right? And so the project is all about trying to hold those outlets up, remind people that we have choices. We don't have to maintain the pattern where 90% of what we consume comes from corporate sources. I'm talking about media consumption.
Right.
They can still produce the 90% of it, but we can make choices to consume from the other 10% that's independent. And when we do, we'll be better informed. We're less likely to be depressed by the news because so much independent news also highlights solutions rather than the problems alone. So we'll be better informed. We'll be less likely to be discouraged and disengaged, and it'll be part of just creating the world that we want to live in.
Andy, thank you so much for being with us. Andy Lee Roth of Project Censored. You can go find out more about this and read in depth both the stories and other the state of the free press at projectcensored.org. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Julianna.
You're watching ACT TV. Guess what? This Saturday, January 15th, is the deadline to sign up for the Affordable Care Act. Have you seen that reported out there or on U.S. mainstream or corporate media? No, because Big Pharma doesn't like the ACA, and all your mainstream news is brought to you by ads for Xeljanz. I mean, literally, who knew that so many people had severe plaque psoriasis? I had no idea. I particularly like the irony of the news media outlets fear-mongering you and scaring the pants off you for 45 minutes straight, and then having, you suggesting that you ask your doctor if Lunesta is right for you. Of course you need a sleep aid. After the nonstop reporting on widespread crop failures and environmental collapse. Oh no, wait, they don't actually report on widespread crop failures and environmental collapse. We just talked about that. Anyway, Saturday, January 15th is the deadline to sign up for the ACA. You still have time. Plus, say goodbye to surprise bankruptcy after visiting the dermatologist. There is a new surprise medical bill rules taking effect this month. And in additional health news, the Supreme Court is poised to rule on vaccine mandates. Laura Packard, Executive Director of Healthcarevoter.org and the host of Care Talk right here on ACT TV, is here to discuss all this and more. Laura, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to see you. And thank you so much for waiting. We had to cover everything that was going wrong in the mainstream media.
Well, also, while we were waiting, the Supreme Court ruled on vaccines. They have ruled. And they ruled that on the OSHA case, that large employers cannot, that OSHA can't make large employers insist that their employees either be vaccinated or regular testing. So OSHA
they
cannot.
No testing too, huh? Wow.
Yeah.
What
so
the
vax or test mandate that OSHA had in place for large employers, the Supreme Court says that is not okay. But they did rule in favor of the CMS case, which means that medical facilities can require vaccination. So large employers, OSHA can't make large employers require it. Large employers can choose to do that, but the government can't make large employers do that. But they can make medical facilities require vaccination.
Okay, so on what basis did they decide this? Because they seem to be splitting hairs based on, if you're a medical facility, you can have a federal government mandate. And if you're a private facility, you can't have a government mandate. But then if you're a private facility, you can mandate it yourself. What can you break down sort of the legal
Well, this just came out minutes ago, so I haven't even read it. I can't really tell you how they
Okay.
split the hairs,
Yes.
but I do think it's interesting that the Supreme Court has stringent policies in place to protect themselves, but they're leaving the rest of us out to dry. So they are not going to let the government insist on healthy workplaces. I mean, this is an obvious thing for OSHA to have control over. OSHA makes sure that your boss can't poison you. OSHA should also be able to make sure your boss can't expose you to a deadly disease.
Yes, that would be good. Oh my goodness. Well, I guess we're going to be hearing a lot about that in the coming days and all of that. I mean, maybe we'll check in with our Supreme Court reporter about how it seems to bring to mind the Hobby Lobby decisions about how you can and cannot, a workplace can't say that you can't have birth control in your healthcare package or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a radical right-wing court, and they are picking and choosing the kinds of things that they support or not, and then they're just fudging the legal piece to get to the point that they want to get to. So it's like Bush v. Gore all over again. They know the outcome they want, and they do not care about the laws in the way of that.
Well, let's talk about some good news that just happened. The surprise bill. Is it called the surprise bill? I mean, talk about what happened. I was very happy to read that I won't be going to as I said in the opening, the dermatologist and getting a $7,000 bill for removal of a spot that I didn't expect. I thought it would be $290, $14 copay or something like that.
Well, surprise medical billing is often what happens when you go to the emergency room and so on, and the doctors that you see are not covered by your insurance company. So this is something that happens when your insurance doesn't cover something that you thought your insurance should cover. So accidents, ambulances, ER visits, that all of a sudden you get socked with a huge bill because
I just had this happen. I just had
you're in anesthesia. You're under your anesthesiologist put you under, and you didn't have the chance to ask them, "Hey, do you take my insurance?"
Yeah, that's what they told me when I was going to give birth. Make sure when you get to the hospital, if you have to have anesthesia, you ask them if they take your insurance. I'm like, won't I be giving birth? Do I have? I have literally. They told me, the birther, not birther, but the birth giving person to stop the process to make sure this guy is taking my copay. It's insane.
Yeah. Hold up. Wait, I'm about to have this baby, but first,
baby, hold on. I have to get my paperwork in order. Otherwise, you got to go back in. I mean, what the hell? I'll have to waddle over to Methodist and get, see if they're, it's crazy. It's insane.
So this fix to surprise medical billing, it passed about a year ago, a little bit over a year ago now. And the reason why it was so hard to get passed is because hedge funds and private equity firms make so much money off of surprise bills. Ooh. So there was a lot of money fighting against a solution.
Can you draw the line? Like, how do they do that? What's the mechanism that they're making money?
Well, more and more small doctors' practices and so on, especially during this pandemic, people have sold out, have gotten bought, and private equity firms see a great opportunity to profit from our broken healthcare system. So they are buying up more and more small doctors' practices and so on. And sometimes what they will do is they won't even contract with anybody for health insurance. And then everything they do is surprise billing, because with surprise billing, they can charge whatever they want, and then they go after you legally to pay it.
But won't they lose like the entire clientele of the doctor at some point after that? Or are they just kind of vampiring out the practice?
Kind of vampiring out. I mean, you would think that hospitals would make sure that everyone in their building took all major forms of insurance, but hospitals don't really seem to care. And that's why people wind up with these enormous bills. But this solution that's now been that has gone into effect as of January 1st means that if you get a surprise bill, it's now between your insurance company and the medical provider to sort it out, rather than involving you in the middle of it.
Oh, I wish that had happened in December because I spent half the month making phone calls.
Hmm.
You don't expect when the doctor says for example, go to Quest and get some blood drawn to get a
Hmm.
$4,000 bill in the mail. Like, I, how could it possibly cost that much in the first place? The price gouging that goes on is beyond me. And then, them not telling you that maybe you'll have to pay that is unbelievable.
Yes.
So now
So
they're
now,
basically going to tell you that you might have to pay $2,000 or whatever it might be.
well, if anybody puts paperwork in front of you that signs your right of way on surprise medical bills, ask more questions before you sign. But I mean, if it's an emergency, you're busy having a baby, you're busy going through surgery on a car crash. You're not gonna check every piece of paper because you're in the middle of being operated
Right.
on. So check before you sign anything. And if you get a medical bill, CMS now has a website and a hotline that you can go to report those surprise medical bills.
Who can we thank for the passage of this uh, bill that says
Yeah, it was a bill.
it's a bill? Yeah. Who can we thank for the passage of this? What groups work to help get it passed, and what politicians can we thank for capitulating to us instead of their corporate donors?
Well, this was a fight for several years, several different organizations. There were many attempts and fails. This happened in the lame duck session of 2020. So some people involved are no longer in office, but it all happened like December of 2020. So probably if your representatives were around then, hopefully they voted for it. This was a bipartisan bill. It didn't get filibustered. It got through the Senate.
Excellent. Well, yes, because even Republicans don't like a surprise bill. Nobody likes a surprise bill. Don't worry, those poor little venture capitalist places, they'll find another way to screw you. They've been doing it. They're very good at that somehow. Okay, so we talked surprise bill. We talked SCOTUS on vaccine mandates. The ACA deadline is coming up Saturday. What do people need to know?
Well, the deadline in most states is Saturday, which is January 15th. So if you want to have health insurance for this year, you should go to healthcare.gov and sign up because time is running out. And even if in the past you couldn't afford the plans, check them out now because thanks to the American Rescue Plan last year, plans are more affordable than ever. So go to healthcare.gov before the end of the day, Saturday.
Oh, that's so interesting. I made mention at the beginning that this wasn't getting a lot of blanketing press coverage. Don't you think that it should? Don't you think that our all of our press outlets should be letting people know that this is happening since it affects them?
Absolutely. But also, you live in New York, right?
I live near New York, in the New York general area.
Okay, because New York and New Jersey, I think they both have their own state-based marketplaces. So the advertising may be coming from your state as opposed to nationally. I didn't see a lot of advertising here in Colorado, but when I was in Arizona over the holidays, I saw a lot on TV. So
advertising, yes, but actual news coverage where your local news person says you can get on the ACA, you can get free healthcare, or not free, but you can get healthcare. That's I feel like that's what you're supposed to do as a news person is tell people what might be useful for them and not have to wait for an ad that's obviously paid for by someone, me, the taxpayer.
Yep.
Right? Shouldn't.
Yeah. And the media should be covering this more because it's an act of public service and that many people will qualify for cheap or free plans. They just have to go to healthcare.gov and sign up.
Okay, so do it by midnight. Do it before then because it's going to get jammed up at midnight with everyone pushing the button right at the last second. So the sooner the better, but you still have until January 15th. Laura, if people need help filling it out, if they're, they can't do it, if they can't figure it out, is there a place where they can go?
Yes. So if you go to healthcare.gov, on that website, you can find local people to help you through it. And that help is free. Whether you call the healthcare.gov hotline itself or whether you call a local navigator, it is free. It will not cost you anything to find out what is available for you.
Huh. Not like TurboTax, where if I actually have a question about doing my taxes when I'm on that service, then they charge you money. Okay. Doesn't the government want my tax money? Shouldn't they set something up like this?
That's a whole other thing. And Intuit has lobbied for years to prevent that from going through because they make a lot of money off of it.
No kidding. Every time I have a question, I'm like, another $20. You get Laura Packard, your show, Care Talk, right here on ACT TV. Tell the people what time and tell them about the show in case they don't know what it is.
Yes. Well, watch us at 4:00 Eastern on Mondays on ACT TV, where we answer your questions about healthcare and health insurance. And also we talk about general larger picture issues like surprise billing or like COVID and how to protect your family, that kind of thing.
Excellent.
So we are off for the Martin Luther King Day holiday next Monday, but we will be back after that.
And you're staying on forever. Is that correct? I'm pressuring you. I'm publicly pressuring you here.
We are at least sticking around through spring.
Yes. Excellent. Very good. Laura Packard, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on the program. Laura Packard from healthcarevoter.org and from Care Talk right here on ACT TV. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, you're watching Act Now. I hope you will act now on some of the things that we just talked about, whether it's going to find an alternative media source or telling people about this particular alternative media source. Gotta say, having that guy on made me feel good about what I'm doing with my life, even though my audience is certainly not the size of Joe Rogan. So here we are. Tell your friends. That's something you could do, or sign up for the ACA if you need it, or tell somebody about the ACA sign up if they need it. So much more coming at you next week. I'm looking forward to it. We have the Jocelyn McCurdy-Keats is coming on with us on Tuesday because she will be with ACT TV live covering all the events in the DC area for Martin Luther King Day. And we'll do a rundown of that on our Tuesday show. What else do I have coming up for you? John Nichols of The Nation is going to come and give us a breakdown about why these progressive candidates that I've been showcasing, who may or may not win, are so important to our democratic process at this time. Got that and a couple of other things and surprises coming up for you next week. We are on it live at 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So set your clocks, set your calendars, click that live alert button on wherever you're watching us. And also, please, again, tell your friends because we're word of mouth. We're not so much algorithm because they don't like what we're saying here. Anyway, I'm Julianna Forlano. Follow me on Twitter and I will follow you back. See you next time.